Are hardware wallets really as safe as we think they are? The recent Ledger debacle has left many of us asking that exact question. Do we really have to trust hardware wallet manufacturers, and are they merely one upgrade away from being able to extract our private keys? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to be going through in this video, so you don't want to go anywhere. Before we can dive into the weeds of hardware wallets in general, it's important to have a bit of backstory on what exactly happened with Ledger. It was a little over a week ago that the company unveiled its Recover service. This is an opt-in feature that allows you to recover access to your device should you lose your seed phrase, that 12 or 24-word sequence of random words you're given when setting up the device for the first time. Now, this service works by splitting your seed phrase into different pieces, or shards. These shards are then sent to 3 trusted third parties: Ledger, CoinCover, and a third provider. That way, if ever you were to lose access to your seed, then at least 2 of these 3 service providers could help you recover it, all for the low cost of only $9.99 a month. Sounds great, right? Well, that's until you find out 2 very important details. Firstly, in order to use this feature, you need to provide ID of some sort. So, you already need to trust that this information won't get out or be shared with someone else. But what really caused alarm bells to start ringing was the idea that a seed phrase could, in fact, be extracted from the device in the first place. That runs contrary to everything that people had thought about hardware wallets. That the private key would remain on the device and could never be exposed or extracted in any way. The uproar was swift and merciless. Polygon Labs' Chief Information Security Officer said on Twitter, quote, "The problem here is that the encrypted key parts are sent to 3 corporations and they can reconstruct your keys." Popular crypto Twitter personality DC Investor said, quote, "WTF are you guys doing? This is going in the wrong direction fast. I would recommend no one upgrade to such firmware." Many others were a lot less generous with their choice of words, and on the first day of the Recover service's release, Ledger was in pure PR firefighting mode. They decided to hold a Twitter Spaces on release day and were at pains to point out that this was only opt-in and people didn't have to use it if they didn't want to. Moreover, users could decline to install the firmware update which carried this new feature. However, this all raised more questions than it answered. For one, would Ledger be providing a separate firmware upgrade that did not include this feature? They couldn't just expect users not to upgrade in perpetuity. Eventually, their ledgers would go out of date and wouldn't support certain apps. But perhaps the far more pressing question that came from this was whether Ledger had the ability to issue a firmware upgrade that could extract a private key. Essentially, are our private keys one poisoned firmware update away from being exfiltrated? How much trust should we place in Ledger's handling of their firmware upgrades? For one thing, it's not as though Ledger has the best record when it comes to storing customer data. The hack of its database and subsequent leak of customer records in 2020 is not easily forgotten. And even if we do fully trust Ledger, what happens if the company is subpoenaed? What if a government agency forces them to issue a firmware upgrade that builds in the backdoor functionality? Now, the backlash only got worse for Ledger the following day. Statements from the company on Twitter only seemed to make an already dire PR situation worse. That's because previous statements had been made that stated that the private key never left the secure element chip. In a tweet from November of last year, Ledger had said, quote, "A firmware upgrade cannot extract the private keys from the secure element." Yikes. All of this raises some important questions, not only about Ledger devices, but about hardware wallets more broadly. So, let's start with perhaps the biggest misconception that we all had. that no key data is ever able to leave the device. Now here I'm going to lean on this tweet thread by Hasib Qureshi, the managing partner at Dragonfly Capital, a crypto investment fund. He presented these two infographics for us. This one is how we used to think hardware wallets like ledgers worked. This one is how they actually work. Now, the secure element chip is like a small computer that also holds Ledger's operating system. This means that Ledger's firmware upgrades can affect the way things function inside the secure element. So, it can be programmed to send back anything that's requested. Now, this is actually required in order for the device to upgrade and support newer chains. Whenever there's a new app being installed on the device, it will, in principle, be able to extract private key data. That's because, in order to support these new chains, they'll need to create a new key that's derived from the master key on the device. Now, I'll also leave a link to the thread by Ledger's CTO in the description for you, as it goes into the mechanics in much more detail. As he makes clear in that thread, using a hardware wallet requires a, quote, minimal amount of trust. This means that every time you've had to approve an upgrade on a Ledger device, you've had to have trust. And as we all know, trust is a dirty word in crypto. It goes against the ethos on which trustless blockchains are built. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, it's not about trust in Ledger per se, but trusting that they won't have to comply with any sort of government requests. Now, Ledger's co-founder and ex-CEO created a Reddit post where he addressed the debacle and said that technically governments could recover the shards and, quote, get access to your funds. I will caveat, though, that this was in the context of the recover shards and not the issuance of poisoned updates. But surely the principle should be the same. In a recent podcast, the current CEO also waved that subpoena concern away by saying that it's, quote, not that common. However, he was reminded that Coinbase was recently subpoenaed for something as simple as customer data. I'll leave a link to that podcast in the description for you folks. Now, one of the reasons for this miscommunication and subsequent PR disaster is that Ledger's code is closed source. Users were never able to peer into the repositories and see how the secure element worked, hence the reason that this all came as a shock. So the result is that many are now calling for the code to be open-sourced. Indeed, I think that this is one of the only ways in which users can fully verify the security of the device. As they say, don't trust, verify. And this is also one of the reasons as to why I have always preferred Trezor's over Ledger's. Trezor's code is open source, and hence there's no room for confusion as to how the devices operate. Moreover, they have the option to generate more than one seed phrase through their Shamir backup. Now, I've talked about this in much more detail in my Trezor video, but it basically allows contingencies for seed loss without having to hand over seed phrases to the manufacturer or third-party custodians. That said, open source is no silver bullet. By opening your code to the world, you're also opening it up to all those who may want to exploit it. Moreover, most Trezor users don't read the code that's being pushed before choosing to upgrade. I can't read firmware code myself, and I am going to have to hope that the white hat hackers out there are better at auditing it than the black hats are. So there is still an element of trust needed in third parties. I'll also add that Trezor devices are vulnerable to what are termed high-voltage glitching attacks. Now, I won't go into the specifics of those here, but I will link to a handy video by Kraken Security Labs that discovered the exploit. The caveat here, though, is that such an attack requires physical access to the device, as well as the tools and technical know-how to execute it. And if you're looking for any other wallet alternatives, then you could consider a fully air-gapped kind. These are hardware wallets that have absolutely no connection to any network or PC, be it through Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, USB, etc. They operate independently, and all transactions are signed via a QR code. Now, one of the better wallets of this variety is the Engrave Zero, which we have reviewed before. And we also have a 10% discount on the Engrave device for Coin Bureau viewers, which you can take advantage of with the link down there in the description. I will note, though, that the code is also closed source, so there is another element of base-level trust in the firmware updates. Although the team apparently intends to release a roadmap for open sourcing their code, so you can keep an eye out for that. There are a host of other hardware wallets you could consider as well, and I'll leave links to all the videos and articles that we have on them in the description too. Now, I would personally suggest buying more than one and spreading your coins across them. Diversification isn't only useful when it comes to the assets that you're buying, but also how you're storing them. So this brings me to the big question of what this means for Ledger, us users, and the hardware wallet sector more broadly. Well, I think the first and most important lesson that anyone can take from this is the importance of crystal clear communication from crypto companies about what exactly can and absolutely cannot be done with their products. This is especially the case with a product like a ledger, which people rely on to store their crypto wealth. You cannot allow the technicality of a device and its mechanisms to justify the omission of relevant information. The misconception that, quote, keys never leave the secure element had become so ingrained that it was almost inevitably going to cause pandemonium when the truth came to light. When it comes to the recover feature itself, well, I would advise against using it or upgrading your devices. Indeed, at the time of recording this video, it appears as if Ledger had already rolled back the initial firmware upgrade. Perhaps they've taken their users' feedback into consideration and ditched the upgrade entirely. We shall see. Either way, this whole hoo-ha has opened our eyes as to how hardware wallets work and whether they were always as secure as we had believed. If there is closed source code, an element of trust has to exist. Trust that firmware upgrades are not being pushed that could one day threaten the security of our assets. Perhaps Ledger will go down the open source path, but, well, I wouldn't count on it. They've already shown that this isn't something that they're keen on doing. Even then, open sourcing code has its own risks. And unless you plan to personally audit the code, well, there are still elements of trust you need to have in the broader community. However, I think the most important thing that was exposed by this fiasco is the constant battle between usability, practicality, and security. There's no doubt that paper seeds are far from ideal. You have to make sure that you don't lose that paper, or worse, that it falls into the wrong hands. This is something that most new users won't fully appreciate. For the next 100 million crypto users, perhaps they will want the option to restore a wallet without having to rely on the paper seed. But that is something that should be completely up to the user. They should not have to rely on third-party service providers that use their ID information. Perhaps a system akin to Trezor's Shamir backup would have been a better option. But then again, is this user-friendly, especially for new users? Do these users still want to hold paper backups? That's not something that I can answer. And it all points to a problem that afflicts the whole crypto industry. The user experience is still a long way from being anything close to good enough. Whatever the case, the last thing we want is new users reverting to holding their funds on exchanges because they find self-custody too complicated. Companies that make these devices should be trying to find solutions that make self-custody simple and user-friendly for all. But it should never come at the expense of the sole purpose of the device. That's my 2 cents, at least. Well, I hope you folks found this video helpful. I'm keen to get your thoughts on the matter now, though. What do you think of this debacle? Have you considered other hardware wallets, and if so, which ones? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget that if you want to pick up any other hardware wallets, I have special discounts for you in my deals page, which is down in the description, so do check it out. And finally, if you found this video helpful, then smack a like on it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you're ready for when our next video hits the tube. Thank you for watching, and stay safe out there. This is Guy bidding you goodbye.